Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, September 16th, 2025, the committee is meeting to study the situation of Francophones and Indigenous peoples in the Canadian Armed Forces. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format. Pursuant to the standing orders, members are attending in person and remotely using Zoom application. Before we continue, I ask participants to consult guidelines on the table. These measures are to help prevent audio and feedback incidences and to protect the health and safety of our interpreters. I'd like to remind witnesses and members, please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. And if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. And for those on Zoom, please use their hand raise function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can. And for interpretations, use your earpiece and select the appropriate channel for either floor, English, or French, also available on Zoom. I'd like now to welcome our witnesses. We have Grazia Scopio, Professor Emerita of Defense Studies, Royal Military College of Canada via video conferencing. We have Danielle Tillett, and I apologize if I screw up your names a bit. I tend to do that, and I do apologize, but she's with us here live, and she's a historian in Indigenous military history. Dr. P. Whitney Lackenbauer, the Professor of Canada Research Chair in the Study of Canadian North, also by video conferencing, and Peter Kickert, the Assistant Professor of Public Policy and Governance for Brian Mulrooney's Institute of Government, also via video conferencing. So I'll pass it over first to Gracia, then to Danielle, then to Dr. Whitney Lackenbauer, and we'll end with Peter Kickert, and you all have up to 5 minutes. So Gracia Scopio, over to you, please.
Good morning, bonjour. I'm Dr. Grazia Scopio. I'm joining this meeting from Kingston, Ontario, situated on the traditional homeland of the Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Anishinaabes peoples. And I'm thankful to these nations for their care and stewardship over this shared land. For over 20 years, I've been conducting research on military personnel, including recruiting a diverse force, gender issues in the armed forces, immigrant participation in the military, and Indigenous peoples in the military. In recent years, the Canadian Armed Forces, or CAF, made strides in its efforts to increase the diversity of its personnel, changing policies and improving organizational culture to become more inclusive and equitable. On the other hand, there are still challenges. I will highlight here only a few of the issues concerning Indigenous members of the CAF, and I look forward to discussing further during the meeting. Representation rates of Indigenous members in the CAF are slowly increasing and currently stand at about 3% of CAF members as being Indigenous. However, this rate is still below the CAF recruiting goal of 3.5% and lower than the overall Indigenous population in Canada of about 5%. Indeed, the CAF is still not meeting its overall recruiting targets. As documented in many reports, as recently as the 2025 Auditor General of Canada report, the recruiting system is very slow, and more than 50% of applicants, including Indigenous individuals, withdraw from the process. Indigenous programs, namely the CAF Indigenous Entry Program, the Indigenous Leadership Opportunity Year, or ILOI, and the Indigenous Summer Programs such as Bold Eagle and Raven, are effective means to attract Indigenous youth. Although the positions are not all filled, and there are challenges to retain participants once they complete the programs. There are also issues stemming from the CAF organizational culture that has not been inclusive towards Indigenous members, despite the creation of supports such as CAF Indigenous Advisors and an Indigenous Cultural Awareness course via distance learning, mandatory for all CAF members, which, however, ends up being a check in the box with not much actual learning. Other issues concerning Indigenous members of the CAF include early attrition and lack of support for travel to attend funerals in remote Indigenous communities for family members that may not fall under the CAF guidelines. Additionally, some Indigenous members have experienced discrimination and racism during their military service, which is also the experience of other racialized groups in the CAF, as evidenced by the recent formal apology delivered by General Jenny Carignan, Chief of the Defense Staff, to current and former CAF members who suffered from the impacts of systemic racism, racial discrimination, and racial harassment during their military service. Despite these challenges and barriers, many Indigenous members choose to join the CAF to serve Canada with loyalty, which in turn provides them with a pathway to economic and social mobility and a fulfilling military career. Increasing meaningful and respectful participation of Indigenous members in the CAF is extremely important for many reasons, including to reflect the diversity of the Canadian Indigenous population, enhance the CAF's presence in the North, and promote reconciliation. So, to paraphrase the words of General Carignan, the CAF can do better and must do better. Thank you. Merci. Miigwech.
Thank you very much. I'm passing it over now to Danielle Tillett. Please, you have up to 5 minutes.
Tanshe, hello. My name is Danielle Teye. I am Red River Métis and settler originally from Treaty 1 territory. I'm now a guest here on the unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. I'm also the inaugural historian of Indigenous military history at the Canadian War Museum. Mr. Chair and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to contribute to this important study. As a historian, I can offer a historical overview of some experiences of Indigenous military service, but I'm not well positioned to speak to more contemporary issues. Understanding the historical context of Indigenous military service can provide us with crucial insights into present-day issues. And as you can imagine, 5 minutes can only scratch the surface of this very complex history. To understand the challenges Indigenous service people faced in the early 20th century World War era, it's critical to consider the broader context of how Indigenous people were treated in general through systemic discrimination and colonial policies and legislation. The government and society's treatment of Indigenous veterans was inexplicably linked to the treatment of Indigenous people in general. There were certain barriers that shaped the voluntary enlistment and service of Indigenous people during this era. For example, initially during the First World War, First Nations people were dissuaded by the government from enlisting. This was partly based on unfavorable and racist depictions in popular literature at the time, which led to a paternalistic logic that the Germans might refuse to extend the supposed privileges of civilized warfare to First Nation soldiers. In the Second World War, recruitment for the Navy and Air Force initially required enlistees to be, quote, of pure European descent and of the white race, end quote. Restrictive policies like these were not applied universally, and as casualties mounted in both wars, these types of barriers were abandoned in an effort to boost recruitment. Conscription, once introduced in both world wars, was intended to include all Indigenous people, or at least the government did not see any reason why it would not. Petitions from First Nations communities across the country argued that the lack of full citizenship rights of First Nations people meant that they should not be forced to go to war like enfranchised Canadians. Eventually, the government exempted all status Indians from being conscripted in the First World War. There was no such blanket exemption during the Second World War, so only First Nations individuals from certain treaty areas where verbal promises were made to not have to fight in future wars were exempt from being compelled to serve overseas. For many Indigenous individuals who served during this era, their wartime service was the first time they had experienced a sense of equality with their white settler peers. but they would return to Canada after their service to the same discrimination that they had known before they enlisted. Indigenous veterans did not generally receive equal treatment after returning to civilian life. Status Indian veterans specifically returned home to life as wards of the state. Restrictions such as the prohibition on the sale of alcohol to Status Indians meant that many First Nations veterans could not participate in Legion activities since liquor was served at many functions. Furthermore, the right to vote federally did not come for Status Indian men until 1960. They did not have the full rights and benefits of citizenship under Canada's Indian Act, but had voluntarily enlisted to go to war for Canada anyway. There was a shared feeling by many Indigenous veterans that there was a disconnect between the significance of their wartime service and sacrifices and the political, economic, and social realities they returned home to. This was in large part because they were excluded in many cases from accessing veterans' supports. Pensions and benefits such as land and financial grants that the government set up to support veterans after both wars were notionally available to all veterans. However, most Indigenous claims were denied. These injustices had lasting impacts on many Indigenous veterans, some of whom went on to organize politically to lobby for Indigenous and veterans' rights after their service. These experiences are well documented in the literature and in interviews with Indigenous veterans. Hopefully, this very brief historical overview has provided some context as you explore more current issues in this study. The challenges Indigenous service people faced in the post-World War era's discriminatory social, legislative, and policy structures persisted for a long time, as did the lack of recognition they received. Merci, and thank you for your time.
Dr. Whitney Leichenbauer, over to you, 5 minutes.
Great, thank you, and I'm glad to be joining you from Oxford County on traditional Anishinaabeg and neutral territory that's covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. So for the last 3 decades, I have dedicated much of my academic career to understanding Indigenous people's service in the armed forces and their contributions to the defense of our homeland. From the onset, I have been enamored with the Canadian Rangers, proud Canadians who serve in a unique subcomponent of the Reserve Force. Their longstanding mission is to provide a military presence in sparsely settled northern, coastal, and isolated areas of Canada that cannot conveniently or economically be provided by other components of the Canadian Armed Forces. And with more than 5,000 members in more than 200 communities, they do so admirably. So in my assessment, the Canadian Rangers are a prime example of substantive versus symbolic integration of Indigenous and military ways of knowing, being, and seeing. We have lots of policies with affirmative language about the importance of Indigenous traditional knowledge and engagement, as well as the importance of consultation and partnership, but that ultimately do not share agenda setting or decision-making authority in a substantive way. The Canadian Rangers are a success story of a practical Indigenous Crown partnership rooted in reciprocal trust and respect. I've written lots of books and articles about the history of the Canadian Rangers, the high rates of Indigenous participation in the organization, and why I see the Rangers as a positive example of reconciliation. I always want to highlight that the Rangers are not an Indigenous program. They are reservists. They are not part of a program. And participation is open to all Canadians. In small communities in our Arctic and North, where Inuit, First Nations, and Métis make up the largest percentage of the population in their homelands, this is reflected in the composition of the Canadian Rangers. Now, the Army's official statistics, we just heard them referenced, are rooted in a highly problematic methodology and skewed self-identification data set that continuously underrepresent Indigenous participation in the Rangers and often exclude the Rangers from statistics on Indigenous people's participation rates in the CAF as a whole. I wrote a report back in 2021 where I suggested if we actually correct the figures for the Rangers, it actually adjusts the estimated number of Indigenous people serving in the CAF at that time to more than 5%. So well above the CAF employment equity target of 3.5% Indigenous representation. So the first thing I'd suggest, have these statistics critically re-examined and updated. I say this because I find the persistent underrepresentation of Indigenous service troubling on various levels. First, it fails to conceptualize the CAF as an employer of choice for Indigenous peoples, particularly living outside of the main population belt. This means a shift in mindset to understanding how we can better support them to reinforce success and expand functional opportunities. If I'm being cynical, I might also read this underrepresentation in the context of Canada's historic failure to credit Indigenous peoples for their services to Canada. And in the case of the Rangers, the per capita rates of service by Indigenous peoples in remote communities in the territorial north and Inuit and Anongot are far above the national average. We need to celebrate this more directly and not turn immediately to the need to increase numbers. And I said the Rangers have always, in my mind, been more substantive than symbolic as a form of differentiated military service that's aligned with the priorities of Northern Indigenous communities. This logic was laid out in the 1970s when the military began to revitalize the Ranger organization in the Arctic, when they moved to community-based patrols with leadership selected by the Rangers themselves. This local self-determination has been a hallmark of the Rangers ever since, and brings legitimacy at the local level. Also, by encouraging Rangers to serve in their home communities, you're leaving talent in the North. You're not trying to recruit it outside of the North, and therefore leaving Northern leadership where it is most needed. The value of this still holds today. Also, the simple fact there's no retirement age is a strong validation of how the military accepts the value of the wisdom of expertise and expertise of elders in enabling safe and effective Northern operations. We can talk during question and answer about how the Rangers use their own equipment on operations, their own clothing, how this fits with Indigenous practices. So to wrap up, a misplaced critique that you might hear is that the Rangers are not trained for combat and therefore do not represent a credible defense. This misses the mark on several levels. First and foremost, the Rangers are force enablers who draw upon their local and Indigenous knowledge to allow other CAF members to apply combat doctrine as required. They are pathfinders and guides. They're mentors and subject matter experts who know their communities and their homelands intimately. We have soldiers and special forces operators and other CAF personnel who can apply kinetic effects if needed. The Rangers will get them onto target efficiently and effectively, and this is a huge competitive advantage. So let's start talking seriously about the Rangers' role as force multipliers. The late Simeone Naluktaruk from Inukjuak described the Rangers to me as the eyeglasses, the hearing aids, and the walking stick of the CAF in the North. In this, he suggested it's actually the regular forces and primary reservists who need the Rangers to enable them. So today, as we seek to bolster our Northern defenses, let's get the equation right. The Rangers are a proven multiplier. If we want a larger product, we need to consider whether the reg force and primary reserves that they are amplifying have the skills and experience needed to be multiplied effectively, rather than thinking we need to retool the Rangers. The old maxim, if it ain't broken, don't break it, applies here. Rangers ensure that the CAF is stitched into the fabric of Inuit, First Nation, and Métis communities across the Canadian North. There's reason why the Greenlanders, the Danes, the Alaskans, the Swedes, other Nordic colleagues are interested in the Ranger model for their countries. The Rangers are inseparable from Indigenous self-determination, authority, and resilience at the community level. And this must guide us forward as we consider how to enhance the organization to enable them more. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Luckenbauer. Mr. Kickert, over to you, sir.
Thank you. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm joining you from Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Thank you for the opportunity to appear today. I've worked closely with the Canadian Rangers for 15 years, particularly in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Canadian Ranger Patrol groups. Many of the Rangers I work with are Indigenous, and much of my research has focused on their roles in emergency response and in building resilience. The Canadian Rangers are one of the most important emergency response assets in remote Northern and Indigenous communities. They are present, organized, trusted, and capable. As Abel Akik, a ranger from Tuliak Nunavut, told me, we are the eyes and ears of the military, but we're also the eyes and ears of our community. We protect our communities. Bubba Peterson, another ranger from Kugluktuk, put it even more simply. We are the people to call when things go sideways, period. And they are. In recent years, Rangers have responded to wildfires, floods, avalanches, severe storms, power outages, critical infrastructure failure, aircraft crashes, and the COVID-19 pandemic. They conduct search and rescue, evacuations, wellness checks, resupply, infrastructure protection. They provide the local and Indigenous knowledge, the situational awareness, and the connections that make outside responses possible and effective. They're exceptionally good at these roles. Just a few weeks ago, 5 Rangers were awarded Medals of Bravery for rescuing 2 stranded French nationals in a blizzard near Nunavut in 2020. During the 2019 evacuation of Pigankakum First Nation, Chief Amanda Sunwap said the presence of Rangers alone brought calm. I don't know what we would have done without them. These are roles that Rangers value and want to perform for their communities, and they are exactly the kind of visible, meaningful activities that draw people to join. But despite this, they face persistent barriers. It is often unclear when and how they can be activated for emergencies and search and rescue. Training opportunities are inconsistent. The emphasis on these roles waxes and wanes with leadership changes and shifting institutional priorities. As one former ranger from Kuujjuaq, Nunavut told me, the roles and expectations change a lot. It's frustrating. We need consistency. We want to serve our communities, so give us the tools and skills to do this. Make it simple. So let me offer 3 recommendations. First, make it easier to use the Rangers. Although the Canadian Armed Forces is intended to be a force of last resort in domestic emergencies, in many northern and Indigenous communities, the Rangers are the only timely and effective response, and policy must reflect that reality. Clarify authorities and reduce jurisdictional friction. Ensure civilian agencies understand Ranger capabilities and how to employ them, and streamline activation processes so they can be deployed quickly when needed. The Memorandum of Understanding on Search and Rescue between 3 CRPG and the Ontario Provincial Police shows what this can look like. Second, give the Rangers the tools they need. Increase and sustain training and exercises that reflect the incidents to which Rangers might have to respond and the needs of their communities. Ground, ice, and light urban search and rescue. Flood and fire response, mass rescue operations, evacuations, wilderness and advanced first aid. Support these efforts with the required equipment and technology solutions, building on initiatives like the new Ranger Team Awareness Kits. Third, we must better understand and support the human dimension of Ranger service. For Rangers, responding to emergencies often means searching for or assisting family, friends, neighbors, and elders. Sometimes it means finding them deceased. A good example of what they face are the many aircraft crashes that Rangers have responded to over the years. Few accidents cause greater physical trauma to the victims, and I've heard many Rangers talk about the effects of responding to these incidents. It's also critical to understand that Rangers often wear many other responder hats. They are volunteer firefighters, paramedics, search and rescue volunteers, and members of the Coast Guard Auxiliary. The cumulative impact of the trauma they experience is profound. A more holistic approach to their well-being is required, including improved awareness of and access to support programs such as the Member Assistance Program and Veterans Affairs Services, critical incident stress programming that better reflects Indigenous realities and requirements, and recognition of their service, including perhaps development of a Ranger Responder Medal. Acting on these recommendations will strengthen more than a capability. It will also bolster Ranger recruitment and retention. It will improve the institutional experience of Indigenous Rangers by supporting them in roles that matter deeply to them and their communities. So I'll close with this. When emergencies happen in Canada's most remote regions, the Canadian Rangers are already there and ready. The question is whether we will give them the tools, the training, the support they need to keep protecting their communities. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
And thank you. I appreciate the opening remarks from all of you in the start of the session. Our first round of questioning is going to go to Ms. Gallant, and you have up to 6 minutes.
Okay, I'll start with Dr. Scopio. The Indigenous Leadership Opportunity Year Program, or ILOI, is hosted by RMC. How many participants go on to join the CAF from that?
I can't tell you numbers right off the top of my head, but I can tell you 2 things. One is that for all Indigenous programs, including the LOI, not all positions are filled. And 2, there's a retention issue. So once participants complete the program, despite how well these programs may be running and how they provide a really good opportunity to attract Indigenous members, there's an issue of retention past the completion of the program. So there's these 2 things. And also, I just want to make sure we understand. So the alloy participants are not necessarily integrated with the ROTP program. Okay, so just it's more like they get a flavor, if you will, of the academic program, but they're not integrated with the ROTP program. So just wanted to make sure everybody in the committee is aware of that. This is not to diminish the importance of the LOI program. It's just to make sure we understand that these programs have limitations, both in terms of recruitment and retention.
So if the Alloy program was integrated with the ROTP, do you think there would be better retention?
I mean, it's possible, but that would present other challenges. So there might be ways to better integrate that, and that would be a question for both RMC and the leadership of the Alloy program, so that we can see if there was a better way to better integrate it. Now, the ROTP is a 4-year program, and there's specific academic requirements to be met, both for entry and for staying in the program. So that part would pose a challenge because they're not the same requirements to enter the Alloy program. But there might be ways to better integrate the two paths, if you will.
Okay. So, Dr. Scopio, how are the youth programs that you mentioned communicated to youth on reserves?
So that's one of the challenges that we found. So in particular, in communities of the North, there are difficulties in recruiting, in accessing the communities to even sort of present these programs, if you will. And there's also, the importance of the face of the recruiters. We know, right? Mm-hmm. So just like the CAF has been struggling for years and decades to increase the number of women in the CAF, still sitting only at about 17%, it's the same with other groups. So the doors are starting to be open, or they are open, if you will, for other groups. Such as newcomers to Canada, right? Permanent residents can now apply finally, but really only a small percentage get in. So it's the same with the Indigenous programs. So these are good programs, and the intention is good, but also the CAF can recruit Indigenous members for their regular service, right? So it does not have to be only through the programs. Those are just a tool, one tool that they have at their disposal. But how many recruiters are Indigenous, right? How many are going to make the journey to northern communities, and so on and so forth?
Okay, Dr. Leckenbauer, why are there no plans from the CAF to set up a youth program similar to cadets or junior rangers programs on reserves?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So first of all, there are junior Canadian Ranger programs delivered in some reserve communities, First Nations communities in the provincial norths. When we're looking at the territorial north, very few reserves, as all of you are aware. So I think there's bigger discussions around how far the Rangers, should extend. But from that standpoint, I'd suggest in communities that are adjacent to reserves or on reserves, there is a process whereby the junior Canadian Rangers can be stood up, and in many cases are. I was just in some communities in the provincial norths where we were having that very conversation, and they are reserve communities.
Okay, so Dr. Leckenbauer, currently we do not have enough Rangers in the Arctic. How should CAF be approaching new recruits to the Canadian Rangers?
So first of all, I don't accept the premise of your question that we do not have enough. I would want you to explain what Rangers are unable to perform in terms of mission sets, and that's just a question. But that said, so when we look at reinvigorating or revitalizing the Rangers and opportunities for recruitment, I think first of all it starts from addressing the lessening of priorities given to the Canadian Ranger Patrol groups in terms of staffing levels, particularly for regular force. We hear talk about Arctic sovereignty and security being the government's foremost priority in terms of defense and security, yet we don't see that matched in prioritizing the resource of support. So if we want to grow the Rangers in the north, That begins by making sure there are more human resources and financial service people to process their claims. It means more ranger instructors to go into communities to be delivering the training to the rangers and to be playing those mentoring roles and to be that liaison with the military. And from that standpoint, I think we can build forward. But again, I still always ask the question, why do we default to suggesting that the problem is the number of rangers rather than providing more opportunities and more supports to the rangers we already have, and want to return back to the notion that Northern Canadians, particularly Indigenous peoples, are already serving in far greater numbers per capita than Southern Canadians are? At what point does it become unfair to constantly be repeating a refrain suggesting that they're not doing enough and they need to be doing more? Perhaps the problem is something else. So again, respectfully submitted, because I think it's a very good question that you're asking. And the question becomes, how do we create more opportunities and more support for people that are in the organization?
Thank you, Mr. Luckenberg. Ms. Gallant. Ms. Lapointe, over to you for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. My question is for Ms. Tayet. What does the historical experience of Indigenous service tell us about how the Canadian Armed Forces should engage with Indigenous members today?
Well, thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. That's a great question. I think one of the biggest challenges historically has been, as I alluded to a little bit in my opening remarks, the fact that historically, Indigenous people have been fully dissuaded or prevented from enlisting, or when the times are more difficult, when casualties are higher, then it's okay for us to recruit you, and those barriers start to go down. So I think a lot of those historical challenges are and have already been dealt with through the more modern times. I've spoken with a couple of Afghanistan war veterans, Indigenous Afghanistan war veterans, who have spoken about how they feel very well looked after by through their experience in CAF. So I think part of what's challenging perhaps is ensuring that people understand their history, I guess, understanding that this is the legacy of decades of discrimination and restrictions that have prevented Indigenous people who have voluntarily wanted to enlist from not being able to. And then, of course, the aftermath being supporting them as veterans after they have served. Some of the folks on the committee may have heard of Francis Pegamagabo. He was an Anishinaabe First World War veteran, very highly decorated sniper. He won the military medal 3 times, one of only 38 people who served for the Canadian Forces. And he was he was denied his claim for when he applied for his supports after as a veteran. So when you look at a story like that, it's potentially hard to motivate people to want to sign up for this. And that's in part why there were also petitions made for to fight against conscription. So I think understanding a lot of those things is probably the first step. As a historian, that's usually my go-to, is learning our history and understanding that this is the legacy.
Thank you. Dr. Kicker, in your opening statements, you talked about Indigenous operational awareness and security. Can you expand on what is meant by that point you were making?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. Absolutely. So in the context I was speaking in, I meant, when you have rangers on the ground who can report back to other external agencies who know what is going on and what the situation looks like, how the hazard is unfolding that they're responding to, it just creates a better situational awareness for all partners involved, which is going to lead to a much more effective response. So again, one of the great strengths of the Rangers is that they're in their communities, they're ready to respond, and they're able to get those eyes on the scene, whether it be a wildfire or a flood or some other critical incident, very, very quickly. And again, bring that awareness to their partners. It also means that they're able to infuse their local and their Indigenous knowledge into the problem, right? So they can share their knowledge about what this fire or this flood might do. again, based on their Indigenous knowledge, also their local knowledge, right? So they know usually everyone in the community, they know who can do what, when. You need some jerry cans, you need some generators, they know who to call. So they infuse all that information into our broader emergency response systems and just make it much more effective.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Scopio, can you speak to the gap between consistent enrollment in Indigenous programs and the persistently low retention rates that follow?
One of the things I think that we should be recommending is to do an analysis of the programs in terms of how they're performing and what they're performing, what the gaps are, and to identify better ways for retention past the programs. So increase recruitment for the programs so that all the positions are filled. These are good opportunities for youth, and in theory, they should all be filled, or most of the time. And then the retention piece. So we spoke about some of the challenges that Indigenous members faced in the past, not the recent past, not the historical past, which were amazing to think about, that they were actually not allowed to join, but even most recently. So that's why the CAF has apologized. So these are real experiences. This is real life experiences. So there are, despite this, the apology is a very good step, very good first step. There's, casual racism, if you want to call it that, right? Where members have, during our research, have unveiled, these kinds of instances. And it could be something like diminishing the experience of the residential school system and the impacts it has had on Indigenous population in attempts of the colonial powers to erase their culture and their languages. So that's just one example. Or sometimes there's tokenism. And so, so not really understanding why inclusion is important, but just doing it as tokenism. Other members have represented to us that the expectation in the CAF is that it's up to the Indigenous members to do the work of reconciliation. Well, no, it's not, right? They can facilitate, they can advise leadership, but they're not to do the work of reconciliation. So I think once, a young person does these programs, completes a program that can be just a few weeks, like the summer programs, or it can be a full year, like the Alloy program at RMC, then they're going to experience some of these, they're going to have similar experiences as members that are serving in the regular force, and they're going to, probably not join. So the CAF is not really presenting itself as an employer of choice. So these are all good first steps, right? Having Indigenous advisors, it's amazing, right? They're advising leadership. Having these programs, it's great. Having, days where we are recognizing Indigenous peoples is great. But, it's a deeper organizational culture that hasn't really changed. I hope that kind of answers the question.
You'll have many more opportunities to elaborate. Monsieur Savard-Tremblay, over to you for 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci à l'ensemble.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to thank all of our witnesses. Ms. Scopio, I am going to ask my first question to you, or I'll let you finish the point you were making, and then I'll ask my first question. You are asking good questions, but sometimes the answer isn't simple, especially if you don't have the full data set. If, for instance, a report were to be drafted on the reasons why there isn't sufficient recruitment and retention, I mean, if you don't have that in place, it becomes really hard to answer some of these questions. So I'm just outlining some of the issues that we have discovered in our research, but I don't always have the answer for this reason. Well, we have some data, and I'd like to ask some questions in relation to that. For instance, we know that the proportion of Indigenous people is the lowest in the Air Force, 2.6%, compared to 3.2% in the Army and 3%-ish in the Navy. You might say the gap isn't that big, but there's still a difference. Could you tell us why this difference exists? That's a very good question. The Royal Canadian Air Force is the only force that doesn't have an Indigenous program. So maybe this is a question best asked to the people in charge. There is a program in the Army. Bald Eagle was the first one, so the Army was the leader, and there was the Raven program in the Navy, but the Air Force did not have a program. Now, is this a reason? I don't know, but as researchers, we ask these questions to know why there is no program in the Air Force. It is indeed very interesting to know that Air Force is the only one not to have a program. So it looks like you think that the Air Force should also have its own program. Yes. And I apologize, I just want to add something. My colleagues talked at length about the Rangers. Of course, it's a program of the Army. Once again, statistics aren't always very clear. It's about 30% of the members of the Rangers who are Indigenous. And Mr. Lackenbauer could correct me if I'm wrong. So that is something that will push the percentage of Indigenous people in the CAF higher versus the Navy and the Air Force. I hope that answers your question. Yes, thank you. You were saying that some programs are being underutilized. So the Air Force doesn't have a program. There's no program, but there are other programs that are being underutilized. Could you speak a bit more to that underutilization? We know that the Canadian Armed Forces have a recruitment problem. It's changing. There is a whole initiative to rectify this situation, to make the forces more agile and to solve this problem. But it will take time. It is just being implemented. So there is a general recruitment program. The Canadian Armed Forces are not meeting their recruitment objectives, not just this year. It's been many years. This is a problem. So this is going to impact any program. If you're not recruiting a sufficient number of members into the Canadian Armed Forces, well, then, of course, you're not recruiting enough women, enough Indigenous members, enough permanent resident members, etc. So they are not meeting their objectives in general terms and including in terms of the Indigenous programs. So right now the objective is 3.5% of representation. This was a target for 31st of March 2026. And it is part of the strategy that dates back to 2022, the retention strategy. And as you're saying, they seem to have failed at that. Indeed, about more than 50% of people who apply to join the forces actually end up withdrawing from the process because it takes too long. So, to be clear, the Canadian Armed Forces do not have an attraction problem. We have enough people out of the Canadian population, women, Indigenous individuals, recent immigrants or newcomers, permanent residents, or members of racialized communities. So it's not an attraction problem. The problem is recruitment. They just announced that there are going to be changes made. As other researchers, I am very happy that this is a change that is going to happen that will help them achieve their recruitment objectives now that they will modernize the system.
Pierre-Paul Goose, I appreciate you being here, and I know you come with some knowledge on this matter, so over to you.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Bonjour tout le monde.
Thank you, Chair. Hello, everyone. I will start with Ms. Teye. You spoke about the warrior culture of the Indigenous people. The First World War, the Second World War, Indigenous people were enlisted massively to help Canada's war effort, and it's part of their warrior nature in a way. What explains the change that seems to have happened in the recent years or decades that leads to Indigenous people being less interested in the Canadian Armed Forces?
Sure. Again, as a historian, I need to point to the history and the legacy aspect. So there was a point just made about the Air Force having the lowest number of Indigenous members. The Air Force was probably the most difficult arm for Indigenous people to get into during the Second World War, for example, because of the reason I first of all stated in my opening remarks, to be of pure European descent and of the white race, but also because of the educational requirements and the legacy of residential schools. So you had higher requirements of education to get into the Air Force than for the other arms of the military. And so even if an Indigenous recruit was not ruled out based on race, they might be ruled out based on the educational attainment. So there are so many different elements that have restricted Indigenous enlistment. And we have to remember these are generational challenges as well. People who served in the Second World War had potentially fathers who wanted to serve in the First World War and have children potentially who may have served after the Second World War. And so similarly to how we have generational impacts from so many things like the residential school system, there are generational impacts. And I've spoken to numerous people who have been told by family members, don't enlist. They're not going to take care of you. They're not going to look after you, because that has been the legacy of the armed forces for generations. And so even though that has shifted significantly, there are many families and communities where that reputation has not shifted.
Merci pour la réponse. Puis vous parlez
Thank you for your answer. You talked about how they were treated. Maybe there are comparisons to be done with Francophone Quebecois members of the forces. If, of course, working in a purely Francophone environment in Quebec, it's much easier. But if you are asked to serve elsewhere or internationally under command, that creates tensions. In some training activities, for instance, activities were canceled and Francophones were sent elsewhere because there was a lot of conflict. So now, in terms of command and control, I worked with General Jocelyn Paul. When I was getting started, he went on to become the general in charge of the Canadian Army, and I was a unit commander at some point. So if we had integration where everyone was working towards the same objective, things usually went smoothly because people had the motivation to keep doing what they were required to do to accomplish the mission. We talked about the Rangers, the mission of the Rangers. I thought that the percentage of Indigenous individuals in the Rangers was much higher than 30%, but the mission of the Rangers in Arctic security context more globally, is this a mission where we have a command and control problem and that Indigenous Rangers feel as if they just have their weapons and they're out there being left to their own devices to collect information? Or do they feel like they really make a crucial part of an efficient military mechanism? Because General Simoneau was saying at committee that there was a lack of equipment and resources. So do the people really feel that they are being valued?
Thank you very much for the question. I think questions regarding current issues with the Rangers would probably better be focused at my colleagues. But
Oui, ça pourrait être pour M. Lackenbauer ou M.
Yeah.
Or Mr. Lackenbauer, if he wants to answer the question.
oh, go ahead, Dr. Lockenbauer. No?
No, thank you. Thank you. Great question. And yes, I think it may in a sense be a command and control problem from the Army side, but I think there's also an issue of making sure that Rangers are validated in the contributions that they're making. We don't do enough celebration of the Canadian Rangers. I believe that the statistics that Dr. Scopio was referencing a couple of times are Canadian Army statistics that often exclude the Canadian Rangers, like a recent census of Canada did, saying, please identify if you serve or have served in the Canadian forces, except Canadian Rangers. What message are we sending to Indigenous peoples who are choosing to serve our country by staying in their communities and sharing their expertise and knowledge in a differentiated form of service by excluding them from it? So I think from the Army standpoint, I think a lot of what's being asked for, at least in 1st Canadian Ranger Patrol Group, where I have a very close relations, I hear repeatedly not that they need more equipment or that they need a change in their overall role, mission, and tasks. What they need are more opportunities to go out in the land. They need faster processing of their pay and their damage claims. They want more opportunities to be able to put on their Ranger hoodie and their Ranger ball cap, and then whatever clothing they have that's appropriate to the environmental conditions at that time of year in their part of Canada, to be able to go out and do more things. So I think as we're looking at ways that we can, and this I think goes back to Ms. Gallant's question at the beginning, how do we increase enrollment? Partly it's celebrating the Rangers, drawing more attention to their value within the Canadian Armed Forces system, how their role as force enablers and force multipliers is valued, is key to Canadian security, has a deterrence effect as well, because it allows for us to economically, with a utility of force, be able to defend our homeland. And at the same time, we can also reduce some of the burdens associated with on-bearing of recruits. And what Dr. Scopio was referring to for the Reg Force and primary reserves, it also exists for the Rangers. What's crushing a lot of the proceeds of bringing in new Rangers is the sheer volume of paperwork that's been introduced over the last 15 years. So one of the downsides, to get back to your question, Mr. Paul Hoos, is that by increasing command and control, we sometimes associate with more accountability and more administrative burden. I think in the case of the Rangers, as long as we're building in the right mechanisms to, yes, of course, refine command and control, but at the same time, make sure that for the Rangers, at the end of the day, what we're doing is providing them for more opportunities to do what they've been doing for more than 75 years and to get on the land even more and showcase to Canadians and our friends and adversaries around the world just what they bring to the table in terms of defending our country.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Mr. Paul Hoos. I am now going over to Monsieur Chris Mallette. Over to you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. My question is to Ms. Tae, Professor Scopio, Dr. Lackenbauer, but if Professor Kickert cares to chime in, feel free. As a member for Parliament for the Bay of Quinte, home to 8-Wing CFB Trenton, as I like to proudly point out here every chance I get, I represent a community that plays a critical operational role in supporting Canadian Forces Station Alert in Nunavut. And given that some bases, like mine, are located in predominantly Anglophone communities, what concrete steps would you say can the CAF take to better educate and prepare personnel and the surrounding civilian communities to understand and respect Indigenous cultures, languages, and the lived realities of the regions, particularly in the North? Are we doing enough in that regard, I guess, is my... So we'll lead off, I guess, with you, Ms. Taye.
Thank you for the question. I think for me, my purview is further back into history than current issues, so I can't really speak to the contemporary challenges. However, I can say historically speaking, of course, the point you're making as well as the previous point about integration of Indigenous people and, let's say, white settler Canadians. A huge part of that is working together and just having that experience of integrating. And so, for example, historically speaking, there were no segregated Indigenous-only units raised in either World War. There were some during the First World War, for example, a couple of battalions that were raised, one of them near the Six Nations of the Grand River Reserve, and one of them in Winnipeg that had a lot more Indigenous enlistment, likely just because of the location of where they were recruiting from. But I think that's part of what, from an Indigenous perspective, part of what led to feelings of equality for the first time. When you live in a very discriminatory and restrictive environment, then to be treated the same as your peers once you join the military, it can be very empowering, and it gave a lot of service people an opportunity to see what's possible so that they could come back. And that's why I had mentioned in my opening remarks that there were pushes to lobby for more supports and more rights. But I can't really speak to the current events. Thank you.
Then can I pass that same question on to Professor Scopio, if I may?
Were you asking?
Well,
can you just sort of rephrase the question?
What steps can the CAF take to better educate and prepare personnel in the surrounding communities, particularly in the South, that doesn't really have a grasp of the Indigenous cultures and the contributions they present and live realities, particularly in the North? What can we better do?
Thank you. That's what yeah. So I spoke before about there is a fairly recent initiative, which is a mandatory course on Indigenous cultures that every member of the Canadian Forces has to complete. However, from conversations with Indigenous members in the CAF, it turns out that the course, which is delivered only via DL, ends up being a check in the box and a page turner. There's not a lot of deep learning happening. So one of my recommendations would be to make the course in person. And maybe it can be partly in person depending on the length, but with advice from Indigenous elders or Indigenous advisors in the Canadian Forces, transform the course so that it's in person. There's also other things, and we can learn a lot, for example, from the New Zealand Defence Force, where they've integrated a lot more the Maori culture, in particular into Army events, including into operations of the military. Now, I want to preface saying, New Zealand, it's a bicultural country. So there's the non-Maori and the Maori, very different from the Canadian society where we're a multicultural country. And within our Indigenous populations, there's a lot more diversity. Whereas in their Indigenous population, they're all Maori. So there are some, within those differences, we can still sort of implement certain changes to integrate in certain events, instances where we can integrate Indigenous culture. So it's not just a standalone Indigenous program, like as we mentioned. I do want to clarify a comment that was made before by my good colleague, Dr. Lockenbauer. The statistics I was referring to are probably about a year old, and it's about 27%. And again, that percentage it's fluctuating, right? Recruiting fluctuates every single day. About 30% of Canadian Rangers are self-identify as Indigenous. It is possible, as we know, that there are members of the Rangers and members of the Canadian Armed Forces who are Indigenous but select to not self-identify. The reasons are many, and we can explore that in a subsequent conversation.
Thank you very much.
I hope that answers your question.
Thank you both. Monsieur Savard-Tremblay, over to you for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Scopio, we heard your point of view on the programs. So there is an upstream component of all this that can be improved, but there also need to be sufficient mechanisms to fight against discrimination and racism. Do you think these are sufficient as we speak? You are asking if there are sufficient mechanisms in place with regard to racism and discrimination. Well, if there is a case that is felt by a member of the forces, there is a reporting mechanism where the person can say, I believe that I have been the victim of discrimination or racism. Do you think those channels, those mechanisms are sufficient? I used to think that it wasn't the case, that these were not sufficient, but since General Carignan apologized personally and on behalf of the Canadian Armed Forces with regard to discrimination and racism towards members and veterans, I think things are going to change. They have to change. There is no choice. Now, will it become much more efficient right away? Well, as we all know, there's always a bit of delay between the intentions and the policies and the actual implementation. So there will be a delay. But we know that since the Haider and Beatty case, for instance, for women, harassment against women and there is no longer any tolerance for that kind of thing. So if in the past there were cases that were just being silenced or going under the radar, that is no longer the case. So the leadership has to be alert if there's going to be a member who is going to report a case of racism. They have no choice. They will have to act. They will have to take action. So what happened in the past can really explain why we are here, but the actions of today will have to be change focused. So the forces have to change and they will change. I hope I've been able to answer the question.
Monsieur Anderson, over to you for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I want to start by recognizing some people in my riding who fought in the war. We have a reserve OKIB, Okanagan Indian Band, and they have a proud history of fighting in wars. William Smith was a tank gunner who was killed in France in 1944. Gunner Robert Sheffield, 19, died in the war. Flight Surgeon Leslie Sparks of the Royal Canadian Air Force died in 1942. And Edward James Tronson went to war with 3 of his brothers and came home. Unfortunately, their mother, Louisa Tronson, died before any of them got home, and they all got home. So I wanted to mention that. I want to set the stage for the next question. It's an interesting one. The modern battlefield in a symmetrical war is something we're just seeing right now in Ukraine. There are 2 tactical scenarios for communication. One is the frontline cities. For instance, Kramatorsk is about 15 kilometers away from the Russians. Surveillance from satellites are high level, drones are medium level and low level. Surveillance, electronic listening devices, electronic scrambling devices. GPS is foiled every time we're trying to use it there. It was trying to direct us into the river. Listening devices everywhere, and AI and advanced signals intelligence. At the zero line, which is a little closer to the Russians, Kupiansk, electronic comms are simply shut down. There's nothing there. This brings a question that I had about the code talkers from World War II. It seems odd in this highly technological environment to talk about something that was in World War II. But in the immediate tactical battlefield, when communications have to be done, what about something like the code talkers? Now, you'd think that, well, in a modern battlefield, you just whip out your cell phone and you use a translator device. Can any one of the academics here tell me how many Indigenous languages are actually on translation devices? Anybody? I've looked around and I cannot find anything there at all. We've got 80,000 Cree speakers in Canada. We've got 40,000 Inuktitut speakers. In a modern symmetrical battlefield where electronic devices don't work, is this, and this is a serious question, is this a possibility? Is this something that should be explored? Yes, sir.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Anderson. A very interesting question. Again, looking at Canadian code talkers, I think a lot of us are drawn to sort of the wind speaker American examples, the Navajo, for example, but we did have Canadians as well, Cree and Anishinaabe, who contributed during both World Wars in a similar function. So I think when we think about, I'm not going to comment on operations overseas and whether or not we have the ability to force generate and force employ that kind of capacity in numbers to be able to have the functional utility you're talking about on the battlefield. When it comes to domestic operating environments, however, if we think about being contested here in Canada and we think about remote regions, I think the ability to have Northern Indigenous peoples speak in their languages, is once again another competitive advantage, and especially when the way I'm more familiar with Inuktitut speakers, and often when they're translating things, they're inventing terms and descriptions on the fly. So it would be almost impossible, even in this day and age, for AI to know what they were talking about unless they were a member of that community. So I think domestically, it certainly has a utility, and in fact, I'd suggest it happens all the time. Our rangers are often out on operations where they're speaking with one another in the language of their community. And from that standpoint, there's something we should consider thinking about how, again, Canada as a whole can leverage that depth of expertise, the vibrancy of the Indigenous languages that we have in our country as a way to think about how we're competing effectively in the 21st century.
Of the leverage that you just mentioned, how would that translate into, we've heard a lot about, casual racism and a sense of racism within the forces. How would that translate into a special, sort of almost special forces cachet that would actually attract Indigenous folks to the CAF?
So I think, again,
Go ahead, please.
No, thanks. I think that's interesting. There was a former public affairs ranger for 3rd Canadian Ranger Patrol Group, Peter Moon, who used to say, the Americans have their special forces. We have our rangers who are very special forces, and spoke about a visit of Indigenous Rangers from Northern Ontario to Fort Knox and how much attention that they gathered. So I think, once again, promoting the Rangers, realizing they are force generated by the Canadian Army, but their force employed as a Canadian Armed Forces capability means they also have participated in training and operations in terms of the balloon incident with Canadian Special Forces. So I think it's also important to see that elevating the Rangers' profile, recognizing and really celebrating the skills that they bring, also contributes to Special Forces, and that they do have a distinct and therefore very elite special skill set to operate in environments familiar to them.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Mr. Romanado, you're up for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and through you, I'd like to welcome the witnesses for being here today. What an incredible panel of witnesses for us. I just want to start with some updates. So this morning we actually had a press conference with respect to the recruitment numbers, and I just wanted to let the members of the committee know that we are actually have outpassed our recruitment targets this year in terms of our recruitment, and while we are happy with that, we still have a lot more work to do in terms of the numbers that we are seeing. There is a huge interest in Canadians joining the Canadian Armed Forces, and we are incredibly happy about that. So I just wanted to flag that one of the areas is that we are at 3.3% in terms of Indigenous members of the Canadian Armed Forces. We're not where we need to be, but again, we are making strides in terms of our recruitment numbers. I wanted to mention to Ms. Taillé, your testimony here has been incredibly powerful. In 2017, I headed up a delegation for the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Passchendaele. And during that trip, we were able to visit the gravesite of Alex Descoteaux. In fact, Mr. Polis was on the delegation with us, and we took part in the Alex Descoteaux run. He was a very famous Indigenous runner and represented Canada at the Olympics and served during the Battle of Passchendaele and lost his life. And we had the opportunity to visit his grave and participate in the Alex Descoteaux run, and it was a fond memory for me. And I think we need to talk more about Indigenous veterans and the work that they have done representing Canada, and also their sacrifices for Canada. So I'm looking forward to coming to the War Museum and perhaps talking some more about Indigenous veterans and the recognition. You mentioned about the recognition. Can you elaborate a little bit more in terms of how you believe we could improve recognition of Indigenous veterans in terms of making sure that they are honored and their stories are told?
Yes, thank you so much for the kind comments and the question. As I said fairly explicitly in my opening remarks, recognition has been lacking for a long time. And just speaking to some of the hard work that has come in that regard, it's largely been through the work of those Indigenous veterans. It's not been something that is necessarily just given by, let's say, Veterans Affairs or CAF. It's been work that those veterans have done in order to achieve that. And of course, after the First World War, for example, the government was not, and society were not interested in that story. And in fact, we saw amendments to the Indian Act, which prevented status Indians from hiring lawyers, gathering politically in order to try and lobby for some of these rights. And so we saw basically a tightening of those restrictions. So that's why it's all the more important, as you said, that we're recognizing this now. As far as recognition in present day, we have every November 8th at the National Aboriginal Veterans Monument, there is a ceremony to recognize Indigenous Veterans Day. We also have programming at the War Museum that we've done. We're still figuring out what this year's program will look like. And I guess from sort of my perspective in the work that I do, it's also about increasing that diversity of perspectives in our, not only our sort of temporary exhibitions, but our permanent spaces, because that's something that we do get comments about is, how come there's not more here? This is important history, and we're a bureaucracy like the public service, right? Things move slowly, but we are working on it, and I think there's still a lot more that could be done, and I'm hoping to grow the profile of not only Indigenous Veterans Day, but also just Indigenous military service in general. I think we need more visibility. We need to see that, and we need people to understand that history so that they're not asking, why do we even have Indigenous Veterans Day? Why do we need a day specific to Indigenous veterans? And that goes back to that entire history that I spoke to. So thank you very much for the question.
Thank you. My next question is for Professor Lachenbauer. You mentioned you focused a lot on the Rangers, and so I'm sure you heard that we recently announced significant investments in terms of establishing a network of Northern Operational Support Hubs, or NOSHs, in the north. We announced $2.67 billion over 20 years to establish them, and the hubs will be located in Iqaluit, Inuvik, and Yellowknife. Can you talk to us a little bit about how these investments in Arctic and in the north can help with respect to making sure the critical infrastructure is in place so that the Canadian Rangers and others can continue to work in the north, but also to defend Canada? As you said, they're our eyes and ears and often the first line of defense in terms of emergency response. If you could elaborate a little bit how we could use this to assist in that regard.
Thanks, Ms. Romanado. That's a fantastic question. Definitely very much welcoming the investments in these northern operational support hubs and nodes. What that will allow is for more agile and effective deployment of southern assets to northern locations. But I love that you're focusing on the benefits that those also bring to people residing in the north. So one of the first steps I would imagine with this infrastructure being established is to figure out what can be dual use or multi-use, meaning what pieces of that infrastructure might also have benefits for the communities themselves. Here, there's been a real effort on developing the partnerships, genuine partnerships, to find out from communities and from Indigenous rights holders what their priorities look like and what their needs are, and to try and find alignments with these military investments. In the specific case of the Rangers, I imagine opportunities for particular buildings to be established as part of these hubs and nodes that would perhaps accommodate the Rangers, their equipment, provide them with a place to train or gather, not only from that community, but other nearby communities, perhaps to also have a parade square for their Junior Canadian Ranger Youth Program, and also serve as potentially a hub for a lot of the other first responder organizations that Dr. Kickert mentioned earlier. So to serve as a function, to be kind of a public safety space within the community. So I really am excited about this. I think the way that these announcements are building upon previous governments and commitments to highlighting the importance of Canada taking action in the North are to be welcomed. I think now we're at a moment for action and making sure that it's aligned with Northern priorities and agendas.
Thank you, Professor. Ms. Raminato. Mr. Skibble, over to you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses today. I really appreciated the questions. I came with a list of prepared questions. However, I've taken so many notes, I hope that I can get through them because the testimony has been excellent. So in no particular order, I'll start with Dr. Kickert. I like your comment. We are the people to call when things go sideways. I really appreciated that, and I hope that people that are listening today online and in the room here take that to heart. I think it's a great quote. But you mentioned facing barriers, and you said about them being the first resort. So could you perhaps, and you mentioned your three pillars there, making things easier to use and making them the first resort. Do you have any suggestions that we could take to heart on how to make our Indigenous units more easy to use and first resort?
Yeah, no, great question. I mean, number one is explaining to, again, civilian agencies what the Rangers can do, how they can be activated, the process for that. And I think that's going to be helping to very much, again, speed up their activation during these emergency situations. Because that's what I hear from Rangers a lot. Something is happening. We want to go. We want to help out. But there's all these hoops that we have to go through before we can actually be activated and before we can actually be used.
Okay.
It's very unclear. And so I think, that's a major issue.
Thank you. That leads to my second question, because you mentioned about streamlining activation. Is there any specific recommendations to streamline that? Because I could see that being a huge frustration, but also would limit the capabilities to force multiply.
Yeah. So again, I can. Search and rescue is a good example for this, right? Clarify when the Rangers can be used for a search and rescue operation. Right now, it's often left to the commander's discretion of what is life and limb. They can be activated immediately, but it's unclear what life and limb mean for a lot of Rangers. So there's a memorandum of understanding between 3 Canadian Ranger Patrol Group in Northern Ontario and the Ontario Provincial Police that lays out a foundation for how to use Rangers quickly and effectively for search and rescue. That is a model that could be built upon for other jurisdictions. But I think, again, it's working with these civilian partners to better understand how they could use the Rangers for a lot of these different kinds of incidents. That's going to help out the entire process as well.
Thank you. The Joint Rescue Coordination Centers often are the ones that activate them. Do you feel that they need better communications and understanding between JRCC and the ranger groups?
So that's a great question. So the JRCCs can activate Canadian Rangers to support, aircraft crashes really, really easily. Sometimes even marine incidents. They could potentially, utilize the Rangers as these kind of secondary search and rescue resources. So that's pretty clear, actually. On more issues with, again, civilian partners like emergency management organizations or provincial police departments, where there's a bit more confusion over how they can be used for things like ground search and rescue. I will say that, so this is actually answering a question that came up about Trenton in particular. Joint Rescue Coordination Center Trenton and 424 Squadron in Trenton have been doing really important work over the last few years in building the kind of relationships with the Rangers that you're talking about there that's going to make them much more operationally effective. So I work with them frequently on something called the Arctic and Search and Rescue Exchange, which brings Rangers down to JRCC Trenton to learn about how the RCC works, how the squadron works, and that kind of face-to-face relationship building in terms of what makes this process work better, that is the absolute best bang for your buck. Get people together in the same room to work through these things, to better understand one another. It's working really well. So again, kudos to JRCC Trenton. JRCC Halifax has also been doing this on their side. So it's really good models to build off of.
Thank you. And my next question for Ms. Taye, sorry. I appreciate the military history background, and that's very important to have those stories in the more modern military. You said that attitudes have shifted significantly, and I'm glad to hear that. I think there's probably more work that needs to be done. You gave an excellent example of 2 Indigenous members who came back from Afghanistan, and you said, quote, they were well looked after. I'm very happy to hear that. That, to me, is the type of story that should be spread among people to support recruiting. What improvements would you recommend, such as those types of stories being shared? And what methods would maybe more traditional methods of sharing that information or more modern methods for getting that positive information out as we continue to improve culture and try to recruit more Indigenous members to these units?
Thank you for the question. Just a clarification. So you're asking about basically utilizing these examples to boost recruitment?
Yeah,
Is that, yeah.
What, we're looking ways to improve so that,
Yeah.
Indigenous people would want to join. If we look at the more modern stories, is that a tool that we could use where things are more positive as we continue to improve that culture?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think if there's one thing I've learned in interviewing veterans and watching or reading interviews with a variety of different veterans, experiences can be very individual. So one experience obviously can't represent an entire group. One person can't represent an entire group, but as you had mentioned, and I had said, there are success stories. One of the veterans that I spoke with of the Afghanistan war was speaking about especially being cared for medically, I guess, for injuries after his service.
Mm-hmm.
And what we've been doing at the Canadian War Museum is a colleague of mine, Dr. Michael Petru, has been collecting oral histories with veterans, not just Indigenous veterans, but all sorts of different veterans, including Francophone veterans, including Indigenous veterans, to speak to their experiences, not only of service, but of what life was like after the uniform comes off and they become a veteran. And so that project is called In Their Own Voices. And I think that's really a big part of that, is letting those veterans speak for themselves in a lot of cases. So for the museum, what we've been doing is we have this oral history project. We're collecting those oral histories so that we can have firsthand accounts.
Okay, thank
Right?
you. I'm going to rush quick. Oh,
Sure.
I need another 30 to 40 minutes for all my questions.
Well, we're going to have another round. So
Thank you.
We'll be able to get back to you. Mr. Watchorn, over to you for 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, puis merci aux témoins.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to thank the witnesses for the very interesting discussions. Now, we focused quite a bit on the Rangers. I just would like to say something. As a previous mayor, when you request assistance, normally it goes up to the city, the province, and then the provinces can ask the federal government for assistance from the Canadian Armed Forces. So it's important to note that they are our partners in that sense as well. I'll start with Professor Kickert to follow up questions asked by my colleague, Mr. Kibble. So training in the north could be done bidirectionally. We can train the rangers, the people out there, but Indigenous populations can also train those who are not used to working in the north. So how can this be done efficiently? I really would like to hear Professor Kicker's point of view on that. How can training be done bidirectionally?
Yeah, that is a great question. Again, that's actually something that my colleague Professor Lockenbauer has written a lot about. But I think from a training perspective, acknowledging right the skill set that the Rangers bring to the table as they train, southern-based military units on how to move and how to function on the in kind of the northern terrain, a role they've been playing for decades and a critical one. So again, when the military is on exercises, when they're doing their training in Resolute or wherever it's going to be, it's often Rangers who are teaching them how to move and to not just survive but thrive on the land. So I mean that training is already ongoing. I think from a bidirectional perspective, what the CAF can bring to the Rangers and facilitate training opportunities for the Rangers is on some of those specific skill sets, kind of as a highlighting, right? Things around how to most effectively evacuate a community, right? How to participate in wellness checks, and in particular things like wilderness first aid or advanced first aid. These are very difficult skills for a lot of Northerners to get trained on. The opportunities are few and far between. Very few organizations are bringing consistent training in these kinds of higher level emergency response skills. So I think maybe that's not always not done through the CAF, but the CAF could certainly facilitate, again, more of that kind of training that will have a direct benefit on the Rangers, but also their broader communities.
Professor Lockenbauer aussi, puisque vous avez écrit là-dessus.
Professor Lockenbauer, you wrote on this topic. Could we please get your perspective on this as well?
Merci, Monsieur Watchorn. Gladly. Dr. Kickert just said there is some of this going on already. I think, first of all, starts with a shift in mindset for southern-based units. Conducting cold weather operation training is not the same as preparing for northern operations. The Arctic is a geographic region. Inuit Nunangat is a homeland. You can prepare on southern bases to go and learn how to fire up your Coleman and set up your army tent. But at the end of the day, you need to be learning ideally from people from the area in which you're going to be operating. So more opportunities for Canadian Rangers to be provided a trip south to do the workup training in support of the southern units who are going to be deployed into the north would be very much welcomed. Rangers certainly embrace these roles when these opportunities are provided. I think at the end of the day, nothing replaces experience on the ground. And in order for this multi-directional learning to go on, it means increasing not necessarily the scale or size, but the frequency and predictability of the kinds of northern operations and training activities across the Canadian Armed Forces. At the end of the day, you're going to learn more, and the multi-directional learning is going to occur and be facilitated by relationship building and more familiarity. So historically, I think we have this very episodic interest in Arctic sovereignty and security issues, which leads us to sort of do a surge of activity and then to let that fall off. What I hope going forward we're going to be investing in is more continuous relationship building and more opportunities for, as you say, that sharing. And I've certainly heard that from many Rangers, particularly elders over the years, that over time, they miss some of the challenging training that they were being provided by Ranger instructors, say 15 or 20 years ago, that they value the opportunity to be learning from these combat arms, non-commissioned officers coming up as instructors. And as much as they teach the instructors, right, they're also learning from them. So the more opportunities we get for this face-to-face interaction, I think the better off we all are.
Merci beaucoup. Puis en même temps, on avait
Thank you very much. We heard from some individuals, and I think I mentioned this last week. Often the equipment that is procured, the specs are drawn up by people who have no northern experience. So I'd like to hear from you. Do the equipment or equipment specs, can they be influenced by people who have good operational experience in the north?
Great, thank you. Another fantastic question. So I've been fortunate over the last couple of months that I've been involved in Operation Nunalivut on 3 different stretches of what has just been an epic Canadian Armed Forces operation led by Rangers going from Inuvik in the Western Arctic across the Arctic Ocean coast, then turning, doing a pivot, going down the Kivalliq coast, Western Hudson Bay, and ending up in Churchill. Along the way, Rangers were very much involved in identifying equipment that would be fit to purpose for this particular activity. I think they've derived a lot of lessons observed that hopefully will be translated into lessons learned about how to conduct agile operations by a small group. Also, when I was in Cambridge Bay, Iqaluit in the Kitikmeot region, very pleased to see university professors and people from Defence Research Development Canada, DRDC, testing some new systems, testing different types of equipment, and actually bringing them to the north, working with rangers to actually ground truth, whether these are actually appropriate. So I definitely see opportunities going forward to use the rangers and other northern experts who are based in the north to be more heavily involved in the process of identifying what is needed and also testing and trialing the different proposed solutions.
Thank you, Professor. I do appreciate your enthusiasm and that of all witnesses in terms of your passion in regards to what's happening here today. So thank you, Mr. Watchorn. Monsieur Savard-Tremblay, up to you for 2.5 minutes plus.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Alors, Madame...
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Scopio, could you talk about the summer programs for Indigenous peoples? You've already mentioned that these are not really well run, but there's the Bald Eagle program. Do you think that that will be a model for these kinds of programs, if you care to elaborate on that? As I said previously, these are good programs that also help attract Indigenous young people into the Canadian Armed Forces. The programs are a success just by the mere fact of existing. But at the same time, there are challenges. For the different programs, one of the challenges is that not all positions are filled for each program, and there are challenges retaining the participants once they have completed the program. There are challenges for Indigenous members in the CAF, and I think the same challenges also exist for the young people who complete these programs. There are cultural problems on the one hand, and these continue, and these are some of the obstacles in the way of young Indigenous people when they are trying to join the CAF. So, in my opinion, there needs to be a study to examine all of the programs and try to see for each program what some of the success stories are, what the challenges are, what they're doing well, but what's maybe also missing. So, for instance, there is no program for the Air Force, but of course that would be a manner of attracting people into the Air Force, because there are some program participants who complete the programs and then go on to join the CAF. So you spoke about Bald Eagle. Is it a bit of a model that needs to be replicated elsewhere? Well, the Bald Eagle was the first one, so it was the model that was used for the other programs that were then created after Bald Eagle. That is why I referred to Bald Eagle, and that's also the most popular or the well-known program. In Indigenous communities, young people need to be aware of these programs. So if there's a program that exists for years and years, of course, more people will know about it, and people will have heard about Bald Eagle. They might have an uncle who participated in that program, etc. And we should also clarify that not every Indigenous person lives in an Indigenous community, so that also needs to be clarified. And because of the impacts of colonialism, there are many Indigenous young people who have lost their languages and cultures. So do the Canadian Armed Forces have the capacity of, or can they act as agents of reconciliation rather than having separate programs, which of course is a very good thing and it needs to be continued and the numbers need to go up, but could the Indigenous cultures be included more so that people can feel safe and included? And when I say people, young Indigenous people is what I'm referring to. And one more thing I'd like to add is it wasn't really in your question that much, but when we speak about the North, there are situations in the North where there is increasing interest from China, from Russia. So strengthening the rangers, of course, they're not all Indigenous, but there's a significant Indigenous representation. It's also important for, in terms of the security of the North for Canada. So I think that we briefly touched upon this point, but in general, having a more significant presence of Indigenous people in the Canadian Armed Forces would be very, very important for the forces, but for Canada in general as well. Thank you.
I am going over now to Ms. Gallant, and you have whatever time you want, it seems. So 5 minutes is a preferable amount.
Thank you, but I won't take it all. So to Dr. Lackenbauer, is there an American equivalent of the Rangers?
Thanks, Ms. Lang. Excellent question. So no, there is not. Historically, one can look to examples where they did have forms of differentiated military service for Alaskans that resembled the Rangers. What the Americans did beginning in the 1950s and early 1960s was move towards a model where their Tundra Army, as they were called, their Alaskan Rangers, to draw that connection, were modeled after the National Guard, kind of like our primary reserves, and then some of them retooled into what are equivalent to our regular force units. So for the last 15 or 20 years, I've been approached by various Alaskan defense experts and even Senator Murkowski herself to provide briefings on what a Ranger model might look like to inspire something similar in Alaska amongst the Alaskan Native communities. We've also had overtures in Canada from Greenland, Kingdom of Denmark, and from the Sami, also looking at the Canadian Rangers as a potential model to inspire things in their countries because they don't have a form of service similar to what we have here. It will never be a cut and paste solution, but one that I think speaks volumes to the international recognition that Rangers have earned and the respect that they've earned.
Is there any other country that has a similar reserve unit? Russia even?
Definitely not Russia. There are others. There's nothing quite the same. So I use the word unique in a very literal sense. I think this is a one-of-a-kind Canadian solution. You could look at Norforce in Australia that in some respects resembles the Rangers in that it puts a priority on incorporating the Indigenous populations of Australia, but there's nothing quite like the Rangers out there. And I know that sounds like I'm being overly nationalistic celebrating this great Canadian story, but in this case, I think it really is.
Okay, so are Rangers ever deployed with Army regiments when there's an exercise or a mission in the Arctic region outside Canada?
So no, that's outside of the Rangers' role, missions, and tasks. I mean, in the case of a general war, the Minister of National Defense, the Crown, could activate different forms of service, but certainly not. The intention for the Rangers is to be serving within their homeland and within Canada. So they are definitely considered a Defence of Canada capability.
The reason I asked is there was a fairly recent Arctic exercise. I believe it was Global Resolve. There were 60 soldiers affected, but 30 has suffered severe cold injuries. So there was no one, no Rangers, no American version of the Rangers to help assist these people or guide them when they just get off a plane and have to trek through the Arctic for the first time.
Ms. Gallant, that's what my contacts are saying as well. I think that's a very poignant observation.
So would the Rangers be interested in deploying?
So again, that's not a conversation I think has been had with the Rangers. I think it would definitely require a pretty fundamental rescoping of their role and mission to be thinking of them for outside of Canada missions. But I think, you know, again, always a conversation that I think is worth having around, you know, whether or not that's an identified need from the CAF as thinking that that's a deficiency that the Rangers could potentially fill. The key part being they would not be there to provide kinetic effects, right? They wouldn't be there to actually be conducting the combat operations. But again, can't emphasize enough. This would be a real rescoping of what the expectations are of them.
Okay, and Dr. Scopio, there are several key Indigenous summer programs I was not aware of until you mentioned, so I looked up to see what you said. Like there's Bold Eagle in Western Canada, Black Bear in New Brunswick, Raven in British Columbia, Carcajou in Quebec, and Grey Wolf in Ontario. They have to be 17 years and older, and in some of the programs they get paid. But the deadline to apply is the end of April for this summer. Some people are only hearing about this for the very first time today. So how could we communicate to the youth who are in sometimes very out-of-the-way places that this is going on and it's an opportunity that they can apply for?
Sorry, I was having a hard time muting myself. So this is a great question. And I just want to clarify again that most of these programs, except for Raven, they're Army programs. To the question of that we had before, how come, we have a much greater Indigenous presence in the Army than as in percentage, because clearly the Army is the largest service, so we are always going to have a greater percentage, but in terms of, proportion. So with that said, I agree with you that we are not doing, if this committee, only heard about these programs, or some of you, have only heard about these programs for the first time today, then we clearly are not doing a good enough job at promoting the programs. So could this be done through better community engagements in Indigenous communities? Yes. But as mentioned, and we all know, not all Indigenous youth live in Indigenous communities. Some have been removed from their Indigenous cultures. They've been removed from Indigenous language. And so through high schools could be another option. So there's so much more that we can do in terms of promoting these programs to Indigenous youth. And we talked about the Alloy as well. So, Alloy is a bit separate from the Indigenous programs. And there's also another program that is a bit shorter. It's almost like a try before you buy. That's also, as part of the Indigenous programs. So the efforts are there, the programs are there, but clearly there is an issue of promotion for these programs. That's why not all positions are filled.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Gallant. Ms. Idlett, you have up to 5 minutes on behalf of the Liberal benches here.
Kuyanami Ixibauteri. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for such great testimony all morning. Special thank you, of course, to Dr. Kickert and Professor Whitney Lackenbauer for all the great work that you do to highlight the importance of Canadian Rangers. So I do want to each ask of you to respond. Maybe the chair can help give you the equal time to respond to this one question. If you could, I would love for you to amplify the voice of any Canadian Ranger that you've worked with to tell us what they've said about what it is so great about being a Canadian Ranger and what they have recommended to make sure that there's more interest in increasing the number of Canadian Rangers. Maybe we could start with you, Peter.
That is an awesome question. Difficult. Rangers are very passionate, so a lot have spoken on this. I'll highlight one of my good friends, Calvin Peterson. Comes from a family that has 4 generations of Canadian Rangers who have consistently volunteered their services to support everything that Rangers do. And I think one thing that Calvin often amplifies is something that we've heard from this committee already, is telling the story more. When Rangers do something that are pretty amazing, broadcast it, talk about it more. Those 4 Rangers from Nauyat who won the Medal of Bravery, why is that story not being wider spread throughout the North and throughout the rest of the country? So I think I can answer that one, fairly quickly. Is tell the story, not just in the North but in the South as well, so people understand what the Rangers bring to the communities, what they bring to the Canadian Armed Forces, and what they bring to Canada.
Thank you, and what a wonderful question. And I don't know that I'll be able to pull out specific quotes from individuals, but to put a few names out there and some ideas. Peter Kunalese, a now deceased ranger from Clyde River, was the individual who said, "We are not just the eyes and ears; we're also the voice of the North in the Canadian Armed Forces." And as many Rangers have said, and also of the Canadian Armed Forces in the North. And I think that that's something to never take for granted. I think of Sergeant Titus Alulu from Mitimatalik, from Pond Inlet, in his Act of Remembrance speech, which he delivered in Inuktitut at the National War Museum during the National Acts of Remembrance last year, and him speaking about the pride of service in the Canadian Rangers. And again, thinking of that national platform to be able to tell a story that I think is sometimes left to the North. And we hear a lot of understanding of the Rangers and how well the Rangers are understood for their service and their importance in their communities, how much pride communities have in the Rangers in the North. I think that's something that Northern, members of the Rangers need to be supported in talking about. I also want to mention Tony Kunuk from Igloolik, from your home community, Ms. Outloat, who was just on Operation Nunalivut, Julia Lanik from McClavitt, Chris A. I took from Cambridge Bay, and all of them, just also emphasizing just the incredible nature of the skills that this diverse group of Canadians brings to the table when it's time to conduct operations. And there's this real sense of unity that they all spoke about, that you can come from different parts of the North, but there's this common love for the land that I've heard from coast to coast to coast from Rangers saying is the unifying element that binds us all together. So how one engages with the land, how one is part of the land, will differ depending upon your background, depending upon where you're from. But there's that common touchstone that we all share as Canadians. And that's something that I think the Rangers does a marvelous job of encouraging. And we heard before the importance of transgenerational transfer of knowledge, of language, of culture, of confidence to go out in the land, how important that is to be handed down to youth. It also needs to be handed down to young adults who maybe haven't had the experiences on the land. And I've often heard from Rangers all throughout the North, the importance not just of the Junior Canadian Ranger program, but also of the Rangers, of encouraging, of incentivizing, of enabling people to go out in the land and really improve those skills and share those skills. So Ms. Idlo, I don't even feel like that did justice to all the richness of the stories and guidance that I've been given over the years from the Rangers, but you can hear from this that I've become their biggest fan over the last 30 years.
Yes, excellent. I could argue that I'm probably an even bigger fan. I think that what the government of Canada in general, the whole bureaucracy can learn from the Canadian Rangers, because what the Canadian Rangers have shown is that when you want to use the strengths of the people that are of their homeland, you'll have success. And using the strengths and skills of what exists in those communities, if more governments did that, we would have a stronger government, I believe. And I thank both of you, all of you, for helping to exemplify the great work that the Canadian Armed Forces does, specifically the Canadian Rangers program. So, thank you so much.
Thank you. I wasn't sure if the other witnesses had anything more to add, Ms. Telliet or Ms. Scopio. Before we go over to Mr. Kibble, you'll be next. Okay, Mr. Kibble, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first question is for Dr. Scopio. You said that you agree it's not a problem of attracting, rather recruiting and retention, and I like that comment. I couldn't agree more, and we've seen some significant issues with recruiting at the schools right now. But I appreciate you also gave a specific, we've been speaking in broad terms, you gave a very specific recommendation, and I'd like to explore that a little bit. You said guidelines for family members, for Indigenous members, is not inclusive. How could that be corrected? And it was in reference to returning, supports for returning to funerals and other medical emergencies. Could you expand on that a little bit so that we could learn and have more information to potentially make this more inclusive? I think that's a very positive solution or suggestion.
Thank you for the question. So the example that was given to us is that sometimes a CAF Indigenous member might have an auntie, right, that is a very intrinsic part of their family, but they would not, if they, at their funeral, they might not be allowed to go under current policy of the CAF. So these are the kinds of things that were brought to our attention during our research. And so currently the guidelines are there, right? They're just not really thinking out of the box to accommodate also Indigenous members whose family ties might not be, what the mainstream Canadian would consider. So that's one of the things that was brought to our attention. Other thing, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, if you had other out-of-the-box suggestions that would help alleviate differences between culture, I think that would support improved recruiting. And, maybe if you could submit some written suggestions to the committee, that would be actual tangible items. And you've given one. I know that for family, normally it's considered immediate family members. However, there are provisions to allow, if you can prove that somebody's an aunt is a primary family member. I would like to move on to your comment about permanent residents. We said that we're at 3.3% Indigenous in the forces. You said that we needed more permanent residents. Could you speak to that in terms of a percentage you think would be a reasonable number?
I looked at the statistics. I don't have them in front of me because that's another area of my research is immigrant participation in the military. So since the CAF just very recently opened recruiting to permanent residents, they have literally all come to knock on the CAF's door, but or many have anyways, but very few have actually gone through the doors. So the statistics are out there. And
off
we can
the top
see
of your head,
that there's a problem.
Do you have a recommendation? Do you
Honestly,
think we should be 100% permanent residents in the military, 5%, 2%?
We should definitely be a lot higher than we are now. So if we're really talking about only say 5-10% get in just for sake of our conversation, then we clearly have a problem. But there's so many occupations in the CAF. So I get that not everybody qualifies as a fighter pilot. That is, a red occupation right now. But there's so many occupations in between.
Of course, yeah.
In all services.
Would it? I could tell you right now that we're at about 20% at the recruiting schools of permanent residents.
in comparison to how many have applied, or
Right
how
now, in
many
the recruiting schools, they're at about 20% permanent residents on course right now.
Okay. Well, the numbers are going up, which is great, and it's a very recent policy, right? Okay. So the CAF just recently started recruiting permanent residents.
Thank you. I
which
didn't hear a recommendation.
Very different from the American military, completely different.
Okay, thank you for your discussion on this. I'd like to move to Dr. Lachenbauer, and I appreciate your enthusiasm for the Rangers. It's a little overwhelming, but I've worked with the Rangers, and they certainly are an inspiring group, and they're well respected within the military. Your comment about they can be part of the reconciliation process within a community, can you expand on that a little bit, please? How they could help with that?
Thanks. It's a great question. And I think in a way the Rangers have represented aspects of reconciliation even before that was a common sort of political concept that we were thinking about as Canadians. What I mean by that is it's predicated on respect, that when things, don't work as expected, people take ownership of it, that you find ways to work together and build forward together, that there are some topics that are understood to be sensitive, and because there are such great personal relationships in place, that you have that interface between the rest of the military and the Rangers in the form of these Ranger instructors who have the relationships to be able to navigate those in a very human way. So that's the one level to engage in. I think on the other hand, it's recognizing the amount of trust that's vested in the Canadian Armed Forces through the Ranger organization. The fact that Northern Indigenous communities are willing to send their young people down to enhanced summer camps in places like Whitehorse. So people from communities that have been ravaged by the traumas associated with residential schools and all of the colonial violence that's been inflicted, to think about the trust that exists, to be giving the Rangers that responsibility because they are trusted and respected, and that if you send your kids there, that same respect will be shown to them as to anyone else is really, really key.
Thank you. I'm from South Vancouver Island. I live very close to the 4th Canadian Ranger Patrol Group headquarters. I've worked with Rangers. I've worked with the Raven program. I'd love to see, and we have a large First Nations population where I'm from, I'd love to see expanded Ranger units on Vancouver Island. Is there steps that the communities could take to encourage that with the Canadian Forces or others to expand Ranger units locally?
Great, thanks. I think that often comes through mayors and council or First Nations chiefs or Métis councils, Inuit leadership. So definitely the process would be to indicate an interest. Again, there's comments or questions, I think, that underlie this about the scope of the Rangers. When we actually look at the growth of the organization and the expansion of the number of Ranger patrols, this is often authorized at the high political level on the grounds of Arctic sovereignty and security. I would encourage you to ask questions about where the actual growth has taken place over the last 20 years, and you'll find that just about all of the growth in number of Ranger patrols occurred in the provincial norths, and therefore not in Inuit Nunangat. Just about every community in Inuit Nunangat that can sustain a patrol has had one for many decades at this point in time. So certainly opportunities to discuss the Rangers or a Ranger type model, opening up more opportunities for service in Southern Canada, I think is warranted, but I think there's a bigger discussion to be had around that.
Thank you. And no one is saying that.
Mr. Kibble, we're kind of out of time.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. I still.
But I do appreciate your enthusiasm in asking the questions, and for that matter, all the witnesses. It was a very vibrant discussion today, and I do appreciate your involvement and your engagement, and that of our members who are asking the questions as well. Our next meeting is going to be on Wednesday. We have 4 witnesses, all Francophone. 1's a professor, and 3 are veterans of the CAF, and we'll continue this discussion at that time. Is the committee in agreement to adjourn the meeting? Yes. All in favor? Meeting's adjourned. Thank you.